All right. All right. So we have here, we're going to be talking about a little bit of art there at, the people gather around Mount Sinai. They're in our little artistic rendition. What we're going to be talking about today, Journey to Sinai. We'll get as far as we can go with Mosaic Sinai Covenant, but we'll be picking that up again on Thursday, as well as finishing out Exodus and talking about Tabernacle. And so you will see part of the quiz asked about Tabernacle, and if you're taking it today or tomorrow, then take a shot in the dark and see what happens. If not, you can wait till Thursday. But there's only one question that asks about it, and it's pretty easy, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, so one of the last things we had left off last Thursday is talking about the kind of feud between Pharaoh and Yahweh, in talking about the 10 plagues. And in talking about the 10 plagues, we talked about 9. We haven't gotten to the last one yet. But one of the things we had brought up is this issue with the Pharaoh's hardened heart and Yahweh's sending of Moses, in part to kind of to set the people of Israel free. And we had talked about what does it mean for Pharaoh's heart to be hardened. Sorry, brain's still foggy. Pharaoh's heart to be hardened, and what does that concept mean, or what does that phrase mean when we read through Exodus? There was a couple of different ways this can be rendered or could mean. What does it mean for Pharaoh to harden his heart, or for Yahweh to harden Pharaoh's heart?
For him to be stubborn and like far away from God.
Yep, exactly. So one of the ways we had talked about it is that it in Proverbs, in the Psalms, you'll see this come up again in Numbers, and you'll see it come up in the prophets as well. This phrase, and they harden their hearts. This Israel will harden their hearts. And what it means is to refuse to listen to God's wisdom. To refuse to listen to God's wisdom. And it comes not from an inability, but rather a refusal. And I need to make that clear. It comes not from an inability, but rather a refusal. That the Bible does not get the people of Israel off the hook because, oh, well, they're just human. There's no kind of privilege lent over because of their humanity, but rather it's an unwillingness, a refusal to cooperate, and a refusal to listen. And so it kind of bucks against some of our sensibilities, especially if we hold on so tightly to, well, they're fallen human beings and therefore they couldn't have done what God was asking them to do. But the Old Testament holds them accountable for their actions in such a way to where it leaves open the opportunity for their obedience. And this is really important. Really, really important. Because again, it extends to Pharaoh himself as well. That again, it's not an inability, it's a refusal or an unwillingness to listen. Does anybody remember the other way that it could be translated or it could be interpreted? That's more socio-historical. That's kind of taken from its context, having to do with ma'at and order.
Yeah, because it could be interpreted. Sorry, excuse me, as like he was feeling very heavy because ma'at, which is like order, right?
Yeah.
Means order. Was like just there was none. Like it was just kind of chaos in Egypt, so he was feeling super weighed down by all that.
Yep. And Pharaoh's heart is supposed to be lighter than a feather. Exactly. So if we combine what's been said already, thank you, Elijah, and thank you, Genesis, and Sequoia, that it was Pharaoh's duty to maintain ma'at, or maintain order, and if Pharaoh failed to do so and his heart was weighed down by injustice and chaos, then in the end, after his life, in the afterlife, when he would be judged, if his heart was heavier than a feather, then he would not be allowed into immortality. And so that being said, that with Pharaoh's heart being weighed down, it happens because of injustice. And so again, that kind of relationship, it could be interpreted either way. But what makes more sense, um, what kind of seems to happen reoccurring is this inability or unwillingness rather to listen to Yahweh or to refuse God's wisdom. And so, right before, the reason why I bring that up is because that's what continues to prompt this last event in the death of the firstborn. And we're going to read through some text, and it's difficult to talk about because of the nature of the content. But there's a few things that we have to remember when we talk about this last plague, and it is a plague. It's not just an act, um, but there's something that the Hebrews have to remember. And it comes with these 3 points: that the Lord is the dangerous and powerful redeemer of the oppressed. The Lord is creator of the entire creation. That the Hebrews are the people who must tell the world the story of how God redeemed and recreated them. Why? So that they might know that Yahweh is God. And so, does anybody want to read these verses for us? Not everybody at once. All right,
I'll do it.
go ahead, man. Thanks.
All right. Yeah, no problem. All right, Exodus 12, 1 through 9. You want me to read the whole thing?
Yeah, please do.
All right, for sure. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark you for the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. To the whole congregation of Israel, that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If the household is too small for a lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, and the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts in the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night, and they shall eat it over the fire. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs.
All right. If you want to go ahead and finish up this last part.
Yeah.
Sweet, thanks.
Yeah. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance.
Sweet. Thank you, Elijah. So there's a few things that I want to focus on as we're looking specifically at this section of chapter 12. And you'll notice there that I underlined and italicized some text that I want for us to see. Part of what we want to do in this course, and we've been doing, is to develop better Bible reading habits. So when we're reading through the text, we're able to take the cues from the authors about what is most important. I bring this up a lot. For those of you that have taken me for Intro to Biblit, you'll know well. I'm always talking about what words are being repeated in a passage. What words are being repeated? What words are being repeated? What idea is repeated either from a different part of the Bible or within the same section of Scripture? And so again, I kind of made it a little easier for you guys to be able to see that what phrase is being repeated. This Passover, pass through, Passover again. And there's a different reason why I had put strike down firstborn here. But again, it's what is being communicated again between the link between the link between this event of Passover and what God is doing in the liberation for the Hebrews. And so, oh no worries, sorry. And this is really important for us to recognize, because what it does develop in the Hebrew kind of cultic system and the way that they celebrate feasts and remembrances is that what Yahweh does or has done in the past is integrally linked to what Israel does in their participation and in their worship, that the two are not separated. That this time for remembrance, this shall be a day for remembrance for you. You shall celebrate as a festival to the Lord throughout your generations. And again, part of what it means to be God's people is to celebrate this event of Yahweh's liberation of his people, to remember that he's delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh, from the house of slavery. So again, here we have this kind of remembrance of what Yahweh has done, and how that influences, leads, guides, initiates what God's people do as an act of remembrance of that event. It ought to sound a lot like what we do with communion, because that's part, again, of what we do celebrate and remember. If we want to make some contemporary connections between that we ourselves take the time to remember what Jesus had done. And likewise, through this feast, the people of Israel likewise not only remember what Yahweh had done in delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians, but also it's meant to shape who they are as God's people. And we'll see that happen more so in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We have these kinds of things that because the Lord has delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians or from the house of slavery, thus you shall be a certain kind of person. And we'll see those prescriptions happen. But this phrase, I will strike down every firstborn, this phrase is often difficult for us to deal with because of what it looks like in the text, which is the death of children and animals. But again, while it's unsavory to us, and I'll talk about the significance of the plague that happens later on, do note where this comes in the context of, on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. And I talked about last class how there was two ways to interpret the plagues, but one of them was seen as judgment upon Egypt's gods. But the gods of Egypt here again did include Pharaoh, does include Pharaoh, and the language what Yahweh is using is again speaking to Pharaoh in language that he would understand, because guess who already tried to kill the firstborn, or killed all the males, including the firstborn? Pharaoh. And so again, you have these 9 times where Yahweh tries to compromise with Pharaoh, but yet this last one speaks straight to Pharaoh and to his heart, if you want to put it that way, in language that he can understand. And so you have here in this last event with the Passover kind of climax and instruction, that you have the pinnacle of the plagues and what they're leading towards, and then a kind of instruction that flows from that, with this kind of day of remembrance that you have in the Passover. You have two of these kind of ideas of Pesach and the destroyer. And the Pesach itself, that's where we get the word Passover. In Spanish, it's a little bit easier to translate or to see. It's Pascal. Or Pascua. That you have these kind of 3 meanings that are interpreted from that specific word in Hebrew: is to have compassion on, to protect, or to skip over or pass over. But rather than having to pick one, we combine elements from these kind of 3 phrases or these 3 definitions. That one of the best way to think of it is one, protection rooted in compassion. Protection rooted in compassion, that this is the way that Yahweh is delivering his people from the hands of the Egyptians, the oppressors. And so again, that it kind of combines different elements from the various definitions in order to help us understand what is happening in this specific event. Protection rooted in compassion. And then with the destroyer, this one's a little troubling. because of the phrasing that we had before. But what it is, it's a plague that's personified in an individual and can only operate within the limitations that Yahweh has given it or set for it. And so again, it's not just something that's just run amok off the leash and then Yahweh has to kind of reel it back in. But no, it's a plague that could only operate within the limitations Yahweh has given. And so again, that it's in this rooted protection through compassion that Yahweh, having looked upon the people at the end of Exodus 2, and now has remembered his covenant and now has acted, we see how this kind of brings the elements together from chapter 2 all the way to chapter 12 and how it's coming full circle in the way Yahweh is now delivering his people from the land of Egypt. And so, but one of the things I want for us to think about, and we won't spend too much time here, there's other things that we wanted to talk about, that as we talk about how we come to know Yahweh, one of the things that I want for us to think about is, who is Pharaoh? The kind of types of Pharaoh. That if Yahweh serves as liberator and redeemer, who might be Pharaoh today? And of course, we could think of a certain person or certain peoples, but more so what attitudes, policies, majorities, and majority opinions exist that perpetuate oppression and keep liberation and reconciliation from being realized or actualized. And that one of the things that I want us to be aware of, especially in our context, is what are those things that bring about death, and bring about oppression. And this gets a little more difficult to talk about, especially now with things kind of the way they are. This was especially difficult last year and a few years before that. But the same difficulty exists. That what are the systems? What are the attitudes or policies or opinions that exist that perpetuate oppression? And again, this is something that it takes a certain amount of kind of self-awareness within our own context to be able to see like what kinds of things are oppressing people, keeping people from experiencing liberation, from experiencing the being a full human being even. And so let me go ahead and just open this up for you guys. What do you guys think?
You're asking us the first question, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I mean, this just helps to think. Like, okay, well, how do I answer this part up here?
So that's the question, right? Who is Pharaoh today?
Yeah.
Would that be kind of be? I don't know if this is on. Well, would it be like it could be like a personal, someone over your life? Like it could be your boss, maybe.
Pharaoh could represent addiction. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if a kind of Pharaoh, and again, this is just it's bringing it up more broadly. The things which act or participate more like Pharaoh than it does like Yahweh, or act like God. Or addiction, other mental illness. Yeah. So one of the things, and I guess I'll give you guys an example. One of the things that what I think we can often miss and I won't spend too long here, but one of the things that I think we often not just take for granted, but we lack, myself included. I don't just say you guys; it's myself included. That with being an American, the kind of power that is afforded to us by natural kind of I won't say natural, but just by being an American, the kind of financial, um, political kind of clout that we have both here and around the world, by way of being an American. And it's not to say that America's a Pharaoh, America's Egypt, as much as it is. It is very easy for us. Oh, all right. Sorry about that. Um, it's very easy for us um, to perpetuate systems of oppression, especially as it relates to what goes on around the world. So one of the issues I've had, it's like 2 years now, is wondering where my clothes come from. That oftentimes when my wife wants to get something Forever 21, I'm wondering why are these T-shirts so cheap? Then you end up coming to find out that it was because of forced labor that these products were made so cheaply. Um, and so, again, this isn't to point out any specific fingers as much as it is that there's something about this system, whether it be capitalism or whether it be kind of just the way that the way that um, the clothing industry kind of works, or at least to maximize profits, that there's something there that is oppressive to people and that's perpetuating injustice, especially when people are being forced to work less, um, forced to work more for less than what they deserve, and especially when it runs them and perpetuates poverty and keeps them living in inhumane conditions and working in inhumane conditions. So that, again, that's just been one of my beefs. That again, it's hard to point a specific finger as much as it might be just a kind of general like, this is a capitalism thing, or whether if it's a fashion industry thing, or whether it's an American thing. Again, it's difficult, and a lot of these issues tend to be like that. That there's a lot. It's kind of like this is how you got to point your hand. If you're going to point fingers, you got to point them like this because there's so many things going on. Um, but again, that's kind of been one of my beefs for the past 2 or 3 years, is trying to figure out like where's this thing coming from. Was slave labor, was child labor used to make this thing? And that why should I get the privilege of paying less while somebody on the other side of the world is either paid less, and not just paid less, but that I'm actually participating in one of these systems that I'm trying to fight against over here. And so that's an example. And I know it's hard to think about that. And was it almost 9:50 in the morning with the drop of a hat? But this is one thing I want us to be aware of. Again, it's we do, as Americans, we do have a lot of privileges that I don't want to condemn us for, but at least to be aware of, that we might use our positions to advocate for others and to share in solidarity with the suffering of those that are most vulnerable and those that often suffer to our benefit in order that we might benefit. Christians who don't believe in women in ministry, they kind of oppress women because they take the Bible out of context and judge women who are in ministry and sometimes call them names. I have an uncle who says he walks out of church if a woman preaches. I told him he's taken out of context and that he needs to study the original text of the Bible as well. But he says you either believe the Bible or you don't. He's a great guy, but I think he has more to learn. He completely just takes the Bible 100% literally without looking at the context and all the spiritual. That's, to me, that's always been ironic for people that take the text seriously, but then avoid so much of the context that comes out of it. Yeah, but I mean, there's that as well, sexism that perpetuates itself, and sadly, it happens a lot in church, and we use the Bible to back it up. Um, and that's definitely an issue too. And my wife experienced that a lot, especially over in the Latino church. That's, some do it better than others, but I've found more often than not, like Mother's Day is really kind of the only day that women get play. I don't know why. It's, but yeah, really, really, really sad. Really sad. And it's stuff that you ladies are still having to deal with. In church, out of church, at school, at work. And again, those of you have it's so bad, especially any of you that have suffered trauma and then try to plead your case and try to have people believe you, because it always seems like, oh well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's BS. It's really weird, really weird. But again, it's part of the system that we're living in.
Because I was fortunate then that my church didn't have the sexism issue.
Oh yeah,
There was roughly the same amount of women leaders as men. And even, in my case, my mom and dad were pastors. They were children's pastors. Dad was the one who actually held the license and stuff, but mom was the real face of it. And like everyone in the church knew that she was the real face of it.
yeah. See, and that's awesome that they were able to kind of take it on together instead of it just being, well, you're the children's pastor because you're a woman and women know how to care better for children. And so the fact that they were able to do it together, that's a big deal.
Well, I mean, mom really was the one who did most of the stuff.
Yeah.
Dad was kind of more symbolic, but that was more their choice because mom, that's where her passion lay. So
yeah, and that makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, and even now, it's something we have to fight against. And as this is just speaking specifically to the dudes, like we are afforded a lot of benefits and privileges by the experience of being a male. If you don't believe me, just go to the gas station at night. Like, and see what kind of concerns you do not have. Walk down the street at night and see what kind of concerns you do not have. Walk by a group of dudes or a group of girls and see what kind of concerns you do not have. And so we as males, we have a responsibility to be able to not just say something, but continue to say something every time it's something sexist comes up. And so it's the least we can do. We can't do anything to reverse the history of what's happened, but we can definitely make changes for the better for the future. And so, all right, Women's History Month. We don't need Women's History Month to say something about it, but I just afforded the opportunity, so why not? All right. So somebody's we got to push back against Pharaoh sometimes. So why not choose to do it? But again, when you see a system that is more concerned about perpetuating its power and keeping it in place, that's when you can start to think along these Pharaoh lines. Because again, that's what Pharaoh does. He consolidated power. Hey, these Hebrews are growing too numerous, so he gets paranoid. Consolidates power like, hey, let's force them to slave labor. And then he chooses to protect it by killing these children from the Hebrew women, specifically males. And so again, anytime we participate in power that serves as self-protecting, that doesn't serve to seek the welfare of the people, that's when we know we're in more Egypt than we are in the promised land, when we're more like Pharaoh than we are like Yahweh. Because again, this happens way too often. And I know it's not a New Testament class, but to bring it up, that what we see God, well, we'll just even keep it to the Old Testament. The way Yahweh uses power, what he does is he creates, but not just for himself, but also to create a habitat, a place, not just both for animals and also to be together present with his people. And that Yahweh creates a space for the humans to be cooperative partners together in fulfilling their vocation throughout the earth. That Yahweh uses his power to create a space, not to eliminate contenders and not to eliminate opposition, but rather to invite, to bring alongside, and to work together with in cooperative partnership. And again, if you want to take it to the New Testament, Jesus, who refuses to call down angels, though he has the power to do so, relinquishes power, lets go of power. Of course, he gets it back, but again, it's through that release that Jesus demonstrates true power. And so it's in those ways that we can behave more like Yahweh, be more like Yahweh than Pharaoh, when we choose to relinquish and to participate together instead of consolidating and being paranoid about competition. All right. I don't want to move on too quick. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Never thought about it with the cheaper clothing brands and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. It's sad. There was a article that was an expose put out a few years ago about Forever 21, and they found out that there was slave labor being used in downtown LA. This isn't happening in a foreign country under like this brick warehouse building underground. Down the street. Down the street. So they seem to have cleaned up a lot of their stuff, but again, when it's international, that's more difficult to uncover. All right. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? I want to make sure to give you guys enough time to, if there is a thought that came up. All right. So, how much time we got? Okay. So we're going to read through this story, but what I want us to do is to be able to identify what is the crisis, what is Yahweh's response, and how will the Hebrews know Yahweh? What is the crisis? What is Yahweh's response, and how will the Hebrews know Yahweh? So Exodus 16, the whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is in between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Here we go. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." What seems to be the issue here? What seems to be the issue here? To give you guys a clue, it's in the last sentence. Come on, it's a struggle we're all having right now. Hunger. They hungry.
Oh.
Is that what you're about to say?
Yeah, my fault.
You're good, man. You're good.
Sorry, I zoned out. What was the question?
What's the issue here? Probably because of hunger. So we're all hungry right now.
Could it also be like a lack of trust too and faith in God?
Yep. And we'll see that especially in this next section.
I find it interesting
Huh.
with the Israelites. Like almost the moment they leave Egypt is when the tension between them and God begins.
Yeah.
Like, the moment they leave Egypt is when that tension that will permeate the relationship throughout the rest of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Up until the exile begins.
Oh yeah. And I'll talk about it in a minute here, but there's definite connections to what's happening here, and yeah, these issues that continue to persist. But there's a fine detail I want us to pay attention to here. And so we'll continue on with verse 4, that then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instructions or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days. And that's because of Sabbath. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us? And Moses said, when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. And so one of the things that I want for us to recognize is the placement of what's happening here, especially as they're departing from Egypt and what is now called the Rephidim, which is the wilderness. What they're now approaching is Sinai, is God's mountain. Again, a kind of demonstration of order rooted in creation, where God is meeting together with his people in a place. And so when we ask again, what's the crisis? We've mentioned hunger. But then there's also a kind of trust or faith crisis in the midst of this. But what is Yahweh's response? What is God's response here in the midst of all that complaining?
That he will provide for everybody.
That God gives them bread. And later on, he's going to give meat. And as we'll see a little bit later on, when they start complaining for water, that same thing happens again. That in the context of complaining, Yahweh provides. But how will the Hebrews know Yahweh? And I'll go ahead and give it away on this slide, but how are the Hebrews going to know?
By the manna that he brings.
Yes. Yes. A different way we might put that is through a kind of experience of provision. And so what we have here is both a food and a faith crisis. It's not one or the other. It's not a physical thing, it's not a spiritual thing, that both of them are integrally tied together. That there's this inability to identify God's presence in the ordinary, because mind you, at this point, God had already provided manna. But the desire is for more. And what Yahweh does is that his response is to gift the people with provision in the wilderness. That oftentimes, if you spend time in church, and if you grew up there, or you may have heard just even from, especially a lot of preachers do this, talk about this as a kind of combating against complaining. And that if you complain, then God's going to take your blessing, then you're not going to see the promised land, then you're not, that's something of some kind of ill fate will happen to you as a result of your complaining. But what we see here is that the people complain and they have their needs met. That there's something to the complaining that Yahweh sees as a logical complaint. Hey, they're hungry. You know what? Yeah, they probably should get some food, so let me go ahead and provide. So there does seem to be some accommodation being had for the people in this kind of context where they're complaining, and it's not seen as rebellion. And that's really important to identify. That they're not, the complaint at this point specifically, isn't so much that a sign of disloyalty. And I want to make that clear, because the struggle between faith and doubt is not the concern. It's between loyalty and disloyalty. Again, the struggle isn't between faith and doubt. It's between loyalty and disloyalty, especially after they had been delivered from Egypt and before they approach Mount Sinai to cut the covenant, Mosaic covenant. The Hebrews will know who Yahweh is through provision being supplied, which is in the form of food. Again, that it's in and through this experience of provision, which brings up the question is, how often do we miss God? Because we look for the big signs. We look for the oceans to always be parted. But when we have stuff like daily bread being provided for us, we miss those. And I know with the pace of life, I often miss this. I have a little sign here. You guys can't see it, but let me see if I can pull it up for you guys. One of the things when I was in counseling, one of the things my counselor wanted me to do is create a list of every day spend time in gratitude. Some of you have a gratitude journal or do something like that. I don't know if you guys can see it because the camera's going to be stupid and it looks like doing something, but there we go. We can kind of see it, kind of not. Depends on the way the angle of the light's hitting it. But anyway, 8 signs you're doing okay. One of them is you have a roof over your head. And the other one's like you wish good for others. You ate today. So a lot of really, really simple things that we can look over. And so again, I just have that sign there for me to remind myself that not only how easy it is to miss um, God's goodness, because we don't necessarily see the oceans always parted open. We don't always see the sea parted, but rather through the daily kinds of things that God does in caring for us as his people, that we can miss it. So again, just want to serve as a reminder that there's always something, not just something to, well, just stop being so sad. God's provided, be grateful. That's not what I'm trying to get at as much as it is that God's already showing his faithfulness if we choose to look at it that way. And it's not meant to be a coercive kind of get over everything, but rather as a, we're going to be okay. No matter how you're feeling right now, if you're feeling great, if you're in a deep, deep, deep pit of depression, if you continue to carry along in the journey, we're going to be okay. We're going to be all right. We're going to be all right. And so,
Are you sure? Yeah.
yeah, we're pretty sure.
You're making it go up. I know.
Okay, she obviously muted. So, all right. Let me see how much time we have. Got about 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I think we'd be able to get to Sinai and Tabernacle on Thursday. But let me go ahead and end here. This specific part, and again, this is where we talk about testing. Because this is what happens right before Sinai, which is going to be, it'll be wild when we get there. But right before we get to Sinai, you have this event that happens that they camped at Rephidim and there's no water for the people to drink. Then the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" And so you have them, the Israelites, in between this place of promise and fulfillment, that I'm going to take you as my people and to bring you into a good and broad land that I swore to your ancestors, but they have not seen it yet. They're struggling in the wilderness to just make it with basic provisions like food and water. And what this wilderness place comes to symbolize as a kind of state of mind or metaphor as being on the journey with God. That it's difficult to gain perspective, and anybody who's been in the middle of the desert knows that. It's hard to tell which way is up, left, right, north, south, east, west, unless you're Bear Grylls and tracking the sun for hours on end and knowing which way is moving east to west and know which ways to look. Anybody Man vs. Wild fans? Love that show. Love that show. Anyway, but again, it's a barren place, that there's not a whole lot there, and it seems God forsaken, but is not. That Israel brings the people into the wilderness to meet with them, to speak with them, to be with them as they're approaching the land which he is leading them towards. There's just not a whole lot going on. Not a ton of stuff going on, but in that place where not a lot's going on, that's where God is meeting with the people. And this provides the opportunity for obedience, which looks a lot like trust. Why? Because there's just not a whole lot to trust in. But in this kind of place, you have this phrase of testing God or putting God to the test. And what it ends up meaning is that it's attempting to put God to the proof, or to have God prove himself in such a way that is manipulative. An attempt, or better, an attempt to turn faith into sight. And again, an attempt to manipulate God to do something that he otherwise might not do. And it's in this way that the Israelites begin to test God. And if your brain jumped over to the New Testament in Matthew 4, where Jesus tells Satan that that you will not put the Lord your God to the test, or you will not test the Lord your God. This is what Jesus is getting at, of trying to force God's hand to do something that he might not otherwise do. And it's, again, not just responding to a request, but again, trying to manipulate God towards one's own will. Trying to manipulate God to act on one's own will. And so, are there any questions thus far? We won't be able to get to the next section. We'll get to it on Thursday between talking about Sinai and Tabernacle. But are there any questions, comments, concerns,
I think
thoughts?
the parallel with Jesus' response to Satan's temptation
Yeah.
is put on even bigger display, because let us consider that Satan uses Scripture's own words. I forget if it's in that one where that response comes to, but it's in one of them. So I think that can sometimes show how we can sometimes use God's own Scripture to try to manipulate.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, the request at that point is for Jesus to turn the stones into bread. And so again, when you're hungry after 40 days, when you're hungry, it's not an unreasonable response. But there does seem to be an element that Jesus resists, and like, I'm not going to try to coerce God into doing what I want him to do, and to try to manipulate in order to make something happen that I want to have happen. And there's a fine line, and I'll talk about that when we get to Numbers. But there is room for that, but not through manipulation. Yeah, there is room for requests and prayer, but there's not a whole lot on the manipulation side, which is what that testing part is trying to get at. And so until we talk about it, don't hesitate that if there's something you really want, not to pray. But I guess I'll tip you guys off because we're running out of time here. But what it has to do with is loyalty. Loyalty. That when our requests are working out our faithfulness and being obedient to what God's called us to do, then that's fine. But again, if it's God, give me this car because I really, really want it, and I feel like it's going to be more fulfilling for me to whatever, like, that's when it becomes a little more manipulative. And so yeah. Or, I mean, even worse, God, give me this or else I'm not going to believe in you anymore, which again has its place. But when it's used to try to manipulate or coerce God, then that's when it seems to have a fine line there. Because yeah, Gideon does that. Have God prove himself, but we'll talk about it when we get there, especially in Numbers. It'll provide some clarity. So again, don't hesitate to make requests when you're praying. It's just again a matter of checking your heart and making sure, okay, is this me just trying to get God to do what I want him to do because I'm really struggling with something, or again in that way. So don't hesitate, but definitely be thoughtful. All right. That being said, if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, I'll be around for a few minutes. Again, office hours today and Thursday, 2 to 4. So you guys have an awesome Tuesday. Sorry for keeping you guys a little bit over. We'll get out early on Thursday. Make it up. Well, all right. You guys have an awesome Tuesday.
Thank you.
Have a good one, Mr.
You're
Partito.
welcome. All right, see you guys.